Hey, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about my experiences with anger and generally my lack of control over my emotions. Another way to phrase that would be how I've never been able to express my negative emotions through any other outlet besides anger. But to start, if you ever had the misfortune of meeting me in person, you'd likely come to the conclusion that I'm a very shy and awkward person. Everything from my body language, facial expressions, voice, and appearance, it'd be reasonable to say that I'm unexpressive and quiet when interacting with other people. Not sure if I'm projecting my own assumptions on that idea of myself, but typically, the more withdrawn a person is, the more likely that they're secretly suppressing a lot of their emotions and often will have unhealthy outbursts when they think no one is looking. At least that's how I conduct myself, and I've never felt too comfortable having this conversation with any friends or family, so why not share my shortcomings with a bunch of strangers over the internet? It might even be cathartic for me because I know a lot of guys my age, or men in general, have a rather pessimistic outlook when it comes to talking about their emotions. And I think that's because societally, men are not really encouraged to be vulnerable around others, nor are we taught emotional intelligence to the same degree as our female counterparts. There's also some individual responsibility at play, as I'm sure a lot of men are either too prideful or too uncomfortable around the idea of opening up to others. But enough with me trying to diagnose the reason for men having a lack of outward emotion, as I'm mainly going to be talking about myself. So, just to try and quantify things, I'd probably destroy thousands of dollars worth on my own and other people's stuff as a result of my lack of maturity and emotional control. I've broken laptops, monitors, phones, keyboards, mice, tablets, and headsets. And I've also put holes in my wall and my door in my old house, either by punching them or throwing stuff at it, and did similar stuff to a lesser extent in my dorm room when I was still in college. I've also done some not so great stuff to myself that I won't get into in this video because YouTube might not like me talking about that. But to get back to my history of anger, I can't really remember that many instances of me acting out when I was a young child, though that could be because my memory isn't that great the further I go back in life. Anyways, it wasn't until I hit puberty can I really start to think of instances where I started to suppress a lot of my emotions, which would then culminate into my many emotional outbursts. Honestly, looking back, it seems odd, but the older I've gotten, the more frequent I've had these moments of rage. Maybe it's some kind of buildup that stems from my lack of emotional development, though. But yeah, during high school was when I had a lot of moments where I just couldn't control my anger and started lashing out at myself and my surroundings. Almost all the events that triggered my anger were from video games, so typically I just grab the first electronic device in my peripheral vision and chuck it at the wall. I would also yell, but that was much more noticeable than my parents and siblings, so most of the time I'd be channeling my anger into the destruction of my personal property. I think that goes back to the fact that when talking with others, I'm not an expressive person, so even when I had little control of my anger, I would still direct it inwards or to my immediate surroundings. Not saying this makes my behavior any better, but at least I made sure that my anger wasn't directly impacting anyone else. It was still inconsiderate though, as my parents were probably much more aware of my tantrums than I wanted them to be. So long as they never confronted me on it though, I would just go on with my day and try to pretend it never happened. But when I moved away for college, my anger got much worse, as my loneliness and stress kept adding fuel to the negative emotions I was constantly experiencing. Though, at least for the years I shared a room with other people, I wasn't a complete asshole. Like, I'm not saying I would start cursing and throwing stuff around while my roommate was still in the room with me, though I think that behavior was driven more by my fear of confrontation than it was consideration for my roommate. If anything, having to share a space with others might have made my emotions worse because I was further suppressing myself. So when I did have time alone, it made me that much more inclined to act out because I knew I wouldn't have that many opportunities. And you would think that it would be a few moments that would set me off, like a big upcoming exam or project that would contribute to my high stress levels. But what really caused most of my outbursts was just trying to deal with the tedium of my routine. As I was getting through college, I took a lot of the responsibilities towards school pretty seriously, up to the point where I often would agonize over even the most minor assignments. On top of that, I didn't have any friends I would see regularly and didn't have any other additional obligations like work to distract myself from school. So that left me with a good chunk of free time to engage in whatever form of pointless entertainment for the day. Rather, that's how I should have spent my time and just be like the average normie whose hobbies consist of doom scrolling or binge watching some TV show. Instead, what I engaged in was activities that immensely frustrated me to no end, which for me were mainly gaming and chess. Which, on the surface, these hobbies seem pretty harmless because it's really up to the attitude of the person playing them on whether they have a negative mental impact or not. But my issue with them was I was always getting into a mentality of basing my self worth on the outcome of a game, where if I did poorly, I would end up in a loop of losing over and over again, creating a bunch of wasted time and mental anguish. And because I couldn't really direct that anger toward anything but myself, I began to feel a lot of self hatred, so much so that I wanted to keep making myself feel worse. Eventually, I would act out in anger by breaking something, and depending on how much it was worth, that would either snap me out of my childish rage, or I'd keep going until I destroyed something that had sufficient financial or sentimental value. And my senior year was probably the worst for my anger, as I finally got my own room, so there was no need to control myself for the sake of another person and their property. I mean, it was still a shared space, as I had two other roommates living with me, but they had their own separate rooms. And they were never going to confront me on my behavior because we're just a bunch of young college age guys. None of them were ever going to show enough concern for me towards getting angry with myself. If anything, they're going to see it as an inconvenience to themselves, but even then, they never called me out whenever I started to make a bunch of noise. I can't really blame them though, because that's a pretty awkward conversation to have with a friend, much less a stranger, because I never got to know any of my roommates that well. But going back to my thought process, I think the reason why I got so angry is because I was fundamentally unhappy with my situation, as college wasn't a very fulfilling experience for me despite taking it seriously. And so when I was doing all this stuff like playing video games or chess, I had this expectation that it was going to be a positive escape from all the work I was doing. But when things didn't go my way, it brought back all the same negative emotions of stress and worry I felt about school. And obviously, I can't express them around other people because I had no one to confide in about my problems. So I ended up suppressing them, making it that much easier to direct them towards what I did for fun when I was alone. Looking back on that time, it's hard to say how I truly felt because even though I had lots of self hatred, it never extended to my goals and responsibilities to the point where I was sabotaging myself in school. Maybe that's because I still had a decent amount of discipline back then, but it was still a painful time for me because I didn't have the maturity to control my anger or have a support system to help me deal with the isolation that exacerbated my negative emotions. Also, to talk about how I process my emotions, I think the reason all my outbursts are in the form of anger is because that was just the most natural reaction over the years, that it just became a habit. During all the moments where I experienced things like stress, fear, worry, or sadness, I never did things like break down in tears or have strong moments of anxiety or panic. And I think that's because of what I mentioned previously, where men aren't really encouraged to be outwardly emotional, with the exception of anger. But if that's the case, it's something ingrained in my behavior, because like I said, I never acted this way if there were other people around. But to talk about how I feel lately, there's really not much to report on. I guess that's the good thing about being a NEET is I don't feel much of anything these days. I suppose it makes sense if my reasoning about why I was inclined to have these fits of anger in the first place are true, because now I have no challenges or obstacles throughout my day that would gradually build up my stress and frustration. Maybe that's a subconscious reason as to why I haven't set any long term goals for myself since I dropped out of school, because I'm trying to avoid settling into a routine that will fuel my emotional outbursts. Who knows, man? This video has kind of turned to shit. It started out as okay, but now I'm just psychoanalyzing myself, and that can't be too interesting for you guys. You probably just want to hear about the times I broke a bunch of my stuff and how it filled me with regret and self hatred. So, here's a short anecdote that's somewhat related to the video. So, in the thumbnail, which I didn't pull from the internet, it's actually a previous monitor of mine. But this story has to do with a monitor that I broke before this one. So, when I was in my first year of college, my older brother was still living with my parents at our house and was clearing stuff out. And he texted me one day asking if he could use my old monitor since it was still at the house and he knew my dad had bought me a new one. But I told him don't bother, it was broken, and he started questioning me on how it broke. But I didn't give him an explanation, I just told him it doesn't work anymore. But fast forward a few months into my spring break, me and him went to visit our cousins, and one of the days we were all having dinner with the family. And for some ungodly reason, he just had to bring up our previous conversation and just said, "Oh, hey, how did your monitor break?" And this was pretty unexpected as our conversation was a couple months ago, so I didn't have an excuse ready and didn't want to admit to my extended family that I broke a $250 monitor because I couldn't control my anger. So I just sat there staring at the floor trying to mumble up an excuse when my aunt just said something along the lines of, well, obviously he was just making out with a hot girl and they accidentally knocked it over in the heat of the moment. And I know she didn't mean to be intentionally rude and was just trying to diffuse the awkwardness of the situation, but it still ended up embarrassing me because the fact that I never had a girlfriend, even then, wasn't exactly classified information. So, yeah, that was just one of the rare moments that my petulant nature actually managed to cause me further pain beyond destroying whatever was valuable to me. Okay, I can't really keep on rambling with this stuff, and I don't have too many closing thoughts on this matter. Even though I'm not an authority on anger management, I would say if you have similar tendencies towards self hatred and rage, then try and get up and lie in bed for like 30 minutes or until you don't feel as upset. Better yet, if the weather is okay, then go out for a walk because you're removing yourself from the environment and you have time to think while getting some physical activity too. Basically, just don't be like me and control your emotions. That's the main takeaway from this. Hope you all had a good new year, by the way, and until the next video.